and find a job so that I could repay him before we left. That was a matter of great importance to me. One thing to Stephen Grandowski's credit was the fact that he had taught his sons to be honest about their debts. That much I believed I would have admitted even when my anger against him was bitterest. The prospect of repaying a debt, however, was very dim. We were penniless, neither of us well enough to take care of ourselves. If I can get rid of this cough and gain some strength, maybe Lonnie can find work for me here in Omaha. Or maybe I can take Joey back to Chicago and then set out for the carnival when Pete gets it going again. Maybe with summer coming on, the maybes cluttered up on my brain and made my temples throb. At 2 o'clock, Joey awoke, and I fed him some soup that had kept warm on the back of the stove. At 6, I was up making a hot cereal for him, but Grandma came over and made me go back to bed while she finished the cooking, and with many little murmurs of sympathy gave Joey his breakfast. Joey began to recuperate immediately. With each meal, we could see new brightness come into his face, new light in his eyes. Janie became his special nurse, and I sometimes caught a twinkle in my young brother's eyes, a twinkle that seemed to crow over me as Janie hovered above him, feeding him, reading to him, pampering him as much as he would allow. Mrs. Arthur, the woman who with her husband had taken Joey into their home that night Lonnie found him, came to visit him on his 3rd day with us. She was an attractive woman, nicely dressed and smelling faintly of a perfume that was like spring flowers. She exclaimed over Joey and cried a little as she sat beside him. Finally, she turned to speak to me as I stood at the head of the bed. "You are the brother he was looking for? You are Josh?" she asked. "Yes." "I could have kept Joey for a while. I could have had the joy of nursing him back to health if he hadn't been so anxious to see his brother." She looked at me almost resentfully, although she smiled. "We're very grateful to you, ma'am. I can't even thank you enough for what you did for Joey that night." Her face relaxed somewhat. "Mr. Broomer told us a great deal of what you boys have lived through this winter. He mentioned that you played the piano quite well." I enjoy playing piano," I answered. "How long have you studied?" "My mother gave me lessons until a couple of years ago when we had to sell our piano. Since then I've learned on my own." "Oh," she said, and looked down at her gloved hands as if she took little stock in the kind of lessons one learns from his own mother. Then Joey spoke up. "If you'd hear my brother play, you'd understand, Mrs. Arthur. He's really top-notch." She smiled down at him. "Then I'd like to hear him play, Joey. Maybe when you're well, you and your brother and Mr. Broomer's niece can come to my house and we'll hear Josh play. Would you like that?" He nodded delightedly. I didn't feel so he nodded delighted. I didn't feel so enthusiastic myself. I had a feeling that she was a woman who would have suffered if music familiar to her was subjected to a little improvisation, a beat that was a little different. But I thanked her. "Yes, I'd like to play for you," I said, but I didn't think it likely that I ever would. She left books and games for Joey, some special things to eat, and some articles of clothing that she said had once belonged to her own children, but which looked suspiciously new. She also brought his old jacket, the $20 overshoes, and a knife with Pete Harris's initials in the handle. And carefully wrapped, as if she knew it was precious, was Howie's banjo in a large cardboard box. During the next few days when Joey and I were alone, I got out pen and paper and began the letters I needed to write. I wrote home first of all. In the beginning, I wrote, "Dear Mom." Then after a long time, I added, "And Dad." I told him how Joey had been found, how fast he was recuperating, how comfortable and safe we were with Lonnie. I didn't say that I'd be homesick, that I wanted to bring Joey home soon. I couldn't quite say that, but I felt that my letter would certainly reassure them. I told them a little about Janie. I sent our love to Kitty. After that, I wrote to Edward C., and then to Emily. I didn't know whether she was Mrs. Pete Harris or not. I simply directed the letter to Emily in care of Pete Harris. She had asked me to write to her, and I wondered what I ever have to say to her. I found that it wasn't hard. I used up page after page in telling her the whole story, and sharing my anxiety and then my joy with her. We were a happy family during those last weeks of March, so happy that I almost forgot the loneliness for home which I had felt earlier. The attention of all of us was centered upon Joey, and our common concern over him made us a tightly drawn little group. Lonnie was especially cheerful these days. He would come home bringing treats for supper, oysters because they were Grandma's favorite food, ice cream because that was Joey's. One night, when I had lost all traces of my cough, he took Janie and me to a movie, leaving Grandma and Joey at home with a big bowl of popcorn he had fixed for them. He spoke of us as his 3 kids. He would ask Janie to read aloud in the evening, and we would sit around the table listening. Lonnie on the old couch, resting his arm around Joey's shoulders. I noticed Grandma watching him on one such night as she stood at her ironing board. There were tears in her eyes. As I grew stronger, I began to think more and more about getting a job. The bread of charity choked me a little now and then. I felt that the proudest moment of my life would come when I could begin to repay Lonnie for what he'd done for us. And when all was repaid, then perhaps home. Perhaps. I wasn't quite sure, but I thought that home was what I wanted. Lonnie recognized my restlessness and need for work. Sure, sure, Josh. I'll keep my eyes open. Something might turn up. We've got to be careful, though. You've lost 20 pounds this winter. I can't let you take on too much until you're husky again. And then one evening, Mrs. Arthur appeared again. She asked Lonnie if she might pick the three of us up and take us to her house for lunch the next day. Lonnie smiled at her. Are you sure you want Josh and Janie, or just this lady killer here? He asked, indicating Joey. She was a pleasant woman, ready to laugh. She said, Joey is my first love, yes, but I want the others too. I want to hear Josh play just to see if what his little brother says about him is true. Lonnie loaned me a decent shirt, and I carefully pressed the old trousers Pete Harris had given me. Joey was fairly well supplied with the clothing Mrs. Arthur had brought him earlier. Janie, of course, had no problems. She wore her best blue cotton dress and tied her hair back with a band of blue velvet. Her costume brought praise from the three male members of her family, a praise that deepened the color in her cheeks, overcoming the freckles and making her very pretty.